I was an engineer, so I kind of grew up with kind of a heavy emphasis in my education on sciences, on mathematics, and so on. When I was in either grad or junior high school, I was placed into kind of an accelerated mathematics program, and that interest in math and physics has always stayed with me, even though I went into other areas academically, but I've always kind of had that as a hobby. And then my father, being an engineer, he used to have friends that came over and played cards every Friday night at our house, or they'd go over to their house, and the friend that was his opposite number was also an engineer, electrical engineer. And one night I remember very vividly, as they were playing cards, they were discussing the Great Pyramid, what an engineering marvel it was.
Right.
So that kind of, that lodged in the back of my brain. And once I got started into the academic area that I started in, the history of the ancient texts and so on, I started seeing things kind of pop out.
Right.
Put it that way in some of the ancient texts, and I started to read them. I should say privately. I never shared my views on what I thought some of these texts really meant,
right.
My philosophy.
Right. No, that's all.
It's kind of a hazardous undertaking.
Yeah, if you want to graduate and get a good grade, you probably don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. But I kept notebooks. I'm an avid reader and note taker, so I keep lots of notebooks. And I have notebooks on some of my thoughts over the years. When I finally quit teaching, that's when I started writing all these crazy notes.
Excellent. Well, that's great. What is it? Did you feel like there wouldn't be an audience for something so? I don't want to say bizarre because I think it's it's perfectly rational and makes sense, but sort of I guess non-mainstream maybe. Did you feel like there wouldn't be an audience? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, no, I've always kind of read off the beaten path, and I'm familiar with a lot of the so-called New Age genre literature and things like that, so I knew there's an audience out there. But what really kind of made me hesitate, as you know from reading my books, they're all kind of heavily referenced, because I felt that the kind of genre that usually occurs in this alternative field of research is so poorly referenced.
Right.
Say almost anything and get away with it. So I determined that, if I was going to write in that field, I was at least going to try and reference and argue my case or my points of view. So that made me a little hesitant.
Right.
But, as for them being bizarre, I think they're still bizarre. They may be rational, but they're rationally bizarre. I don't know quite how to put it.
Well, that's great. Rationally bizarre is good. That's maybe I'll start a band named Rationally Bizarre. That sounds like a band name. But anyway, so let's get into Secrets of the Unified Field Theory. Before I start asking you about what you've written in the book, how did you get to writing about the Philadelphia experiment, and maybe tell us about that?
Well, that's one of the things that always interested me. When I was in college, I picked up Hurwitz's and Moore's book on Philadelphia experiment. I think it was called Project Invisibility, because I saw it on a bookstore. It was on a paperback rack, and it was kind of intriguing. So I picked that up and read it. And my interest being physics, I thought, wow, this is really cool.
Right.
So that's a little thing that lodged in the back of my mind, and so when I started doing this, writing these books, I figured, sooner or later I'm going to have to write a book about the Philadelphia experiment. So that's how Secrets of the Unified Field kind of germinated. I wanted to do it, though, after I had written a couple of books on what I thought to be kind of the out-of-the-box physics thinking that the Nazis were up to, because it comes in a series, as you know, of other books about Nazi physics.
Sure.
I thought the Philadelphia experiment coming where it did during the war and showing the American side of the same type of thinking would be kind of an interesting combination.
Excellent. Well, you started out and you mentioned in the beginning that you're not interested in Gnostic speculation. Tell us why would you say that? Because is it just because a lot of alternative researchers are so fascinated with or have flirtations with Gnosticism, and how does that relate to the multiple dimensions and things like that you're going to get into?
Well, I do think that they have that tendency in the alternative research field. Very few of the people that write about these things, about these bizarre experiments, really do so, at least from my point of view, from a standpoint of an adequate grounding in the physics literature, period.
Right.
And they get into these very bizarre kind of quasi-religious, quasi-philosophical speculations, and I just avoid that,
right.
As you know, in those books, because I think that there's a better way to approach it.
Absolutely.
You can reference the scientific literature period and show the concepts that work without having to go into,
Yeah.
put it in the introduction to that book. You don't have to go into channel messages from
Right. Exactly.
all of this nonsense.
Right, exactly. Well, one of the things that I thought was really cool is that you made what I guess we could call, I don't know, high physics, if you will. You made it readable. Was it difficult to boil this down into something that sort of the pop, I don't want to say pop audience, because I don't want to think that I'm a pop audience. I mean, certainly in terms of the physics, I mean, it's over my head, but was it difficult to boil down a lot of these concepts?
Well, no, not really. I think many people have the wrong impression about physics. They open the physics textbook and they see a lot of equations. That
Right.
goes originally. But, the secret is to, open a book like that, and if you don't understand the math, then read around it.
Right.
And you can, Einstein had a very interesting little saying, and he said basically that the ability to do theoretical physics really comes down to being able to make pictures in your mind.
Yes.
And then the math follows that. So, it's really not that difficult, having a bit of a higher mathematics background throughout high school. I'm able to draw the picture, I think, for
Sure.
people. It's really what I'm trying to do.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get into it.
Sure.
You started out talking about the theory itself, and you talk about Kaluza, and you talk about Gabriel Cron. Tell us about those two guys. Tell us about what their breakthrough was, and what was up with him and Einstein, that weird sort of trilogy there.
Well, it's an interesting history that most people are not aware of.
Right.
And even if you read the popularizers of theoretical physics, like Michio Kaku and
Yeah.
so forth, they don't really tell you the full story about the tremendous ferment in physics between two world wars. And by that I mean that you have not only the development of these unified field theories, and Theodor Kaluza was a German mathematician. It's very important to realize something about him. He was not Jewish. So in other words, this man remained in Nazi Germany during the war. He continued teaching mathematics. But basically, Theodor Kaluza formulated the first post-general relativity formal mathematical unified field theory. And what modern presenters of this history will tell you is that all of these unified field theories that came after it, and including Kaluza's, were incomplete because they only attempted to unify gravity and electromagnetism. They did not deal with the strong and weak nuclear forces of quantum mechanics.
Okay.
But the problem is what they don't tell you, and I think to a certain extent they may be unaware of the fact that Gabriel Cron, who you also mentioned, was a Hungarian electrical engineer. He was Jewish, incidentally, but he was something of an engineering and mathematical genius.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did was he took the tensor calculus, which is the kind of mathematical language that was used in those higher dimensional theories,
Right.
and he applied these higher dimensional theories to the analysis of large networked electrical systems, including large networked rotating electrical systems.
Right.
And he said that basically these higher dimensional theories were the theories that could explain what electrical engineers were noticing as anomalous phase creeps and other such things
Yes.
in these large network systems. Now, what he's just told you, really, and incidentally, he publishes this finding in the year 1935. So, in other words, this is before World War II.
Mm-hmm.
It's published in Europe at the University of Liège in Belgium. And he wins the prize, incidentally, for this paper. So, this was quite a little accomplishment. But
Right.
what he's just told you, when he says that these unified field theories can be used to explain what we electrical engineers see, is that the fabric of space-time is engineerable
Right.
with laboratory bench technology that existed in 1935.
Wow.
So in other words, while they may be incomplete theories from
Right.
a theoretical physicist's point of view, they're nevertheless engineerable theories.
Right.
In other words, you can couple electromagnetism and gravity. And
Yes.
of course, cross the border in Nazi Germany. They're listening to this development very closely.
Certainly.
So out of this, I think, if you kind of put the concepts together, I think you have a great deal of impetus within Nazi Germany to develop these types of engineering principles of these unified field theories. And of course, the mask behind which they hide this development is, of course, well, it's all Jewish physics, and we're not interested. But well, in the meantime, in their secret laboratory,
Right.
they're pursuing all of this stuff with the engines.
Absolutely.
And in the United States, of course, where Crone eventually ends up working as an engineer for General Electric, you have the sudden emergence, in 1940s of the Philadelphia experiment. And again, I think the physics basis behind it is precisely some of this thinking.
Right. Excellent. Well, I'm sure you've piqued a lot of people's interest. Let me ask you this: what the illustrations that you've given, and just before I came across your materials, I'd read sort of some poppy stuff, I guess you might say, from Lisa Randall, her book Warped Passages, and she's an MIT professor. That book is really good because it boils down the idea of multiple dimensions and what that means, why it's relevant, and what you're writing about is the same type of thing, but in terms of making it engineerable and what the U.S. Navy and what our government was trying to do in terms of this higher level physics. And so, just sort of as a lighter note, have you ever read Flatland? Did you like Flatland?
I've heard of the book, but I haven't read it, so I can't, I'm really not in a position to comment. But basically, I think your idea there is that we can imagine existing on a two-dimensional world
Yes.
and encountering three-dimensional objects.
Right.
Perceive two dimensions. Well, the same sort of technique, mathematical technique, is really applied in some of these unified field theories because
Yes.
they are all beginning with Kaluza or higher dimensional theories.
Right.
Kaluza's theory is a five-dimensional theory of time and four states. But essentially, any unification in physics is, by the nature of the case, going to be, in terms of mathematics of dimensional analysis, is going to be, horse in my throat. Frog in my throat.
It's no problem.
It's going to be a higher dimensional theory.
Well, okay, so Einstein, if I remember correctly, Einstein's onto this, and then he sort of puts it away for a while, and it doesn't.
Well, Einstein, when he first read Kaluza's paper, he thought very highly of it, but he withheld it from publication until about a year actually after Kaluza had first submitted the paper. I think Kaluza submitted the paper in 1929, or pardon me, in 21, and Einstein eventually decided to sign off on the paper and allowed it to be published in the Prussian Journal of Sciences in 1922. And he was so enamored with the theory that he actually himself began to do his own unified field theory papers. The first one he wrote, I think, was 1925. He kind of sketched the basic plan of attack, so to speak, in a paper that he published in that year.
Okay.
And then his first fully kind of fleshed out idea of it was in 1928, a very significant paper that he wrote. And his last paper that he published in Germany on unified field theories was in 1931. But again, like Kaluza, they're all higher dimensional theories.
Right.
And he continued his work more or less the rest of his life in trying to find some way to unify all the fields of physics. His primary difficulty, as most people know, was in his difficulties with quantum mechanics.
Right.
He was never successful with theoretical unification. So we're told.
Sure. Well, why do we need to unify gravitational and electromagnetic fields? What for listeners? What are they after? What's the goal of this?
Well, essentially the goal is I think, ultimately to be able to manipulate gravity. I mean, in practical terms, that's it. In theoretical terms, the goal is quite simply that most of the physics since general relativity has approached gravitation as a geometry. In other words, it's a field theory.
Right.
So as a result of this, since electromagnetic theory is also a field theory with its own peculiar geometry, then they decided that, there's got to be some underlying unification because of these similarities in
Right.
geometries. But getting the two together, of course, is where we have to have the higher dimensions, because basically gravity in general relativity is kind of a spherical geometry. If you can imagine a bowling ball on a trampoline,
Right.
the trampoline would represent the fabric of space-time, and that's the kind of geometry that you're dealing with general relativity. With electromagnetism, the geometry that you're dealing with is kind of a donut or a torus.
Mhm.
I'm sure your listeners have seen the kind of three-dimensional computer-generated versions of the Earth's magnetic field.
Right.
Again, that's kind of a donut shape.
Yes.
So, in order to unify these two, three-dimensionally discrete geometries into a single geometry, you have to invoke higher dimensional mathematical topologies in order to do that.
Exactly.
That's basically the theoretical basis.
Right. Okay. Well, on the flip side of that, when you mentioned Michio Kaku, and that in your analysis, what he says that he's missed what Cron is after. And
to me, I find that very peculiar, because Kaku certainly is not a stupid man by any stretch.
Absolutely, right.
And he is certainly aware of most of the physics literature.
Sure.
The difficulty is that Cron, when he published his papers, he did so largely in engineering journals, so it may simply be a case of, it's a body of literature that's unknown to him. The other difficulty that I encountered is finding Cron's papers.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's very difficult. I think I put in the introduction to Secrets of the Unified Field that when I tried to get a hold of one of Cron's papers on interlibrary loan, the librarian came back with a form, sent me a form in the mail saying it was only available from one source. It was a corporate source, a private corporate library.
Oh, wow.
And it would cost me $1,200 just to rent. If there's an effective way of suppressing information,
that would be it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of that suppression, okay, so if Kaku sort of bypasses or misses or whatever, is you also talk about physics for mass consumption, and I know that in my personal experience in college classes, even though I don't have the sort of mathematics background, just I guess from sort of philosophical presuppositions, myself majoring in philosophy, I sort of solve problems with the physics for mass consumption, as you talk about. Do you think that this is in some way, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is there a kind of mass consumption physics that sort of is put out there to hide this more secretive higher physics?
Well, to answer the question and to put the words in my mouth, yes, I do think that there's a mass consumption physics, and I do believe that, at least from my own research and the more I delve into all of this, I'm convinced that it is a deliberately constructed mass consumption.
Well, amen. Yeah. I didn't want to make you say that, but I was hoping you'd say that. Right.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I think. I think it's a deliberately designed mass consumption physics, designed to dead end. In other words, designed to keep people more or less in this energy box
Yes.
that we've been in since James Clerk Maxwell. So, just to kind of rehearse the history a bit. When Maxwell, let's go to Michio Kaku. When you go to Kaku's book called Hyperspace, towards the back in the footnotes, he represents what he calls Maxwell's equations. There are four partial differential equations back in the footnotes. Well, in actual fact, those four equations are not Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations were in a completely different mathematical language when they were originally published, a language that's all but extinct now in physics, called quaternions. Okay, although Kaku does use some quaternion mathematics in his string theory textbook, but basically quaternion mathematics that Maxwell expressed his unified electrical and magnetic theory in, we're dealing with basically 22 variables, 22 unknowns. But one of the most interesting features of his original theory was that he included this mathematical language precisely because it was his understanding that you could stress the physical medium, or what he called the ether, electromagnetically. The man that edited those equations into their current four partial differential equations form was a fellow by the name of Oliver Heaviside, and he did so precisely with the intention to get rid of this idea of stressing the physical medium directly with electromagnetic means.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one suppression. The next stage of suppression came with, of course, Nikola Tesla.
Yes.
Because Tesla, in his Colorado experiments, from my own point of view, came very much to an experimental verification of what Maxwell had been talking about by stressing the medium. Okay? In other words, Tesla, to his dying days, insisted that what he was talking about with his beaming of electrical power without wires was that he had discovered an electrical longitudinal wave. Let me explain very briefly what that is. If you take a jump rope and suspend it between two people and then kind of jerk it up and down, that will transmit an S wave, a typical Hertz wave. Okay? That's what most people in physics are taught, is the sum and substance of electromagnetic theory. It's a Hertz wave.
Okay.
Now, when you jerk that jump rope, most of the energy is lost in that jerking motion. Most of the energy is lost in the up and down motion of the wave itself. And very little of it actually is transmitted to the person on the other end of the rope. Okay?
Gotcha.
But a longitudinal wave is a pressure wave. It's like a sound wave. It's a wave of compression and rarefaction in whatever medium that you're dealing with. But Tesla said that he had discovered electrical longitudinal waves. If we can draw an analogy then, what we do is we have our two people suspend a yardstick between them. And one person on one end of the yardstick pulses it or pushes it repeatedly, and the other person, of course, will feel all of the force of that pulse coming through the ruler on his end. Okay, so it's a very efficient form of energy transmission. So Tesla discovered this principle, and then, of course, he wanted to commercialize it. So he talked to J.P. Morgan about, wireless transmission. And Morgan thought basically he was talking about some sort of wireless telegraphy. Only at a later point does Tesla inform him, no, I'm talking about beaming electrical power itself.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So what does Morgan do? Morgan pulls the financial plug.
Right.
And there is a certain amount of indication that Morgan was even behind some of the mathematical trickery, let's put it this way, that was involved in the suppression of the whole idea of the ether.
Oh, wow.
That gave rise to the theory of general relativity. So there is a very, very interesting history of suppression that goes back for quite a while, and it becomes palpable and evident once you get to World War II, because by that time, of course, that off-the-books physics goes deeply black and becomes the basis for all of these very weird and exotic secret weapons projects, particularly in Nazi Germany.
Well, I was going to ask you about Tesla, because anywhere that you begin to read about him and his experiences, you immediately encounter all kinds of dubious activity and suspicious things, and governments, agents, stealing his briefcase full of the death ray theories. And of course, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we have death rays now, so I think that's absolutely possible. On this question of the ether, I remember being in one of the first philosophy classes I was in college, and I remember we read some of the Greeks, and I asked the professor, I said, this individual was, he taught both natural science and philosophy, and I said, this ether thing sounds really cool. Why do we not hear about this anymore? I sort of speculated. I said, well, what if this, and again, I'm just sort of being intuitive. I mean, I don't know any of the physics, but I just said, philosophically speaking, it seems like, the ether would answer quite a bit of philosophical problems. And then, just in my own reading later on, having read Dr. Richard Hoagland's book, and I know you've had some familiarity with Dr. Hoagland, in his book Dark Mission, he speaks at length about the ether. Tell us about that. How does that relate to the unified field?
Well, it's actually ether, the ether was a term that 19th century physicists used to explain physical medium. To draw an analogy, sound requires some sort of physical medium on which to propagate. So in other words, you're hearing it, my voice through the air and then via telephone wires and so on and so forth.
Right.
But, water or any solid substance will transmit sound. So physicists reasoned that electromagnetism also had to have some physical medium on which to propagate, because after all, electromagnetism is simply a waveform, okay, whether it be a longitudinal wave or a Hertz wave, either one. They reasoned that it had to have some sort of physical medium upon which to ride, so to speak. Okay. So they coined the term ether for what they believed to be a very, very superfine matter, okay?
Right.
That they believed was, here's the key word here, that was incompressible, okay? Now, when you run across the term in Tesla, he will tell you, if you dig long and hard enough, that his experiments had shown him that in the ether, and he was an ardent believer in that up until the day he died.
Right.
That he will tell you that he discovered that the ether was in fact possessed of quasi-hydrodynamic characteristics. In other words, it could be itself compressed or rarefied. Okay. Now, the ether as a philosophical and physical concept fell out of use in physics as the result of, and I get into this incidentally at quite some length in my very first alternative book called The Keys of Death Star, because you have to understand the effect that this experiment had on the development of theoretical physics.
Okay.
It was called the Nicholson-Morley experiment. An experiment was designed by two American physicists to take a light beam and split it and re-interfere the light on a filter or grid, if you will. And they split the light beam in perpendicular angles, okay, one running along the axis of rotation of the Earth and another perpendicular to it.
Okay.
Because they reasoned that as the Earth moved, the ether would blow by the Earth, okay, the ether wind, in other words. And as a result of that, the speed of light would detect that very fine wind of the ether as it blew by the Earth. And when the light was re-interfered on one pattern, if it showed an interference grid, like, a ripple in a pond, if it showed an interference grid, that meant that there would be an ether drag. Well, they performed the experiment, and of course, they did not detect any interference pattern. And they did this several times. And to their perplexity, they published the results of the experiment. Now, what happened after that was, of course, Einstein latched onto that experiment, and he reasoned, okay, if this is true, then we've got to reformulate the fundamental truth in physics, namely that there is no ether. This is the rise of special relativity, and this is the rise of the idea that the speed of light is a constant velocity in all frames of reference, okay, to all observers.
Right.
Now, there was a French physicist, however, and this is the part of the story, again, that you don't hear in physics texts, okay? There was a French physicist by the name of Georges Sagnac in 1913 who said, okay, the reason you didn't detect an ether drag is you're measuring the wrong thing in the wrong place in the wrong way. Okay? He said essentially that space-time is not a nice Cartesian rectilinear box.
Right.
If you look and observe nature, particularly physical systems like planets, solar system, and so on and so forth, they're all rotating systems, okay? So he set up his own version of the Nicholson-Morley experiment on a phonograph platter, okay? And he took a light beam, very sensitive measuring equipment, took the light beam and split the light beam and ran the light beam with the direction of rotation on the phonograph and then against the direction of rotation on the phonograph plate, and then re-interfered these two light beams, and voila, what did he get? He got an interference pattern. So there is an ether effect, but Nicholson and Morley, by the way they had configured their experiment, were not measuring for the rotational effects, okay? Now, the interesting thing that happens here, Jay, is that because Sagnac had performed his experiment in 1913, and Einstein had published in Special Relativity in 1905. The relativists quickly jumped in and tried to explain Sagnacs' experiment in terms of relativity. So in other words, we're dealing here with a philosophical presupposition that has now taken hold and is now being used to explain an experiment that contradicts that very relativistic theory.
Right.
You know, physics is full of stuff like this that you really have to dig for these off the wall or little known experiments and papers to see really what's going on.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Well, I'm enthralled. I mean, this is just fascinating. This is.
It is fascinating.
So okay, so
fascinating.
So you being an expert, is it off to try to make a connection to the ancient theory of the ether? Is that, in other words, was that on to something, or is this?
Oh yes.
Okay. Okay. Excellent.
It was.
Okay.
In one of my books called "The Keys to Death Star Destroyed," it's the last book in the series on the Great Theory.
Okay.
I take some of my private notebook jottings and actually publish them as an appendix to one of the chapters in that book. And most of the texts that I'm dealing with there are the Hermetic texts from the Hermetic Neoplatonic texts.
Right.
And if you look at those texts, not with a metaphysical set of spectacles on, but with a topological, mathematical set of spectacles, if you look at it with a physics set of spectacles,
Right.
what they're really talking about when they are talking, in my opinion, is they're talking about the physical medium. And what really pops out, and this to me was just absolutely breathtaking, and that's why I never shared it with any professors at the time. They would have thought I was mad. They
Right.
still do.
Right.
But what really popped out was that in these texts, in certain passages, the topological metaphor is profound because the view of the physical medium, of the ether, that's being presented is that it is an information-creating medium. And that's particularly true of texts with an Egyptian provenance like the Hermetica. So, this to me was absolutely breathtaking because you don't find within theoretical physics that idea re-emerging in so many terms until quantum mechanics, and more importantly, you don't find it arising until about the 1970s with some work that was done in the Soviet Union. The very same sort of work, incidentally, using the same type of mathematics to model the ether or the physical.
Okay. Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you just for the sake of listeners. Explain what you mean by an informational medium.
An information medium. Well, it's very simple. If you have, just kind of picture in your mind's eye, a physical nothing. For a physicist, a physical nothing is simply anything that's not observable.
Okay.
So if you have an infinite extension of the same thing, you have a physical nothing. Okay.
Right.
Now let's assume that at that moment, let's assume that you have a thumper. Okay, and he thumps a bead. He takes his finger and he just lightly plucks that physical medium.
Okay.
Now at the instant that this happens, you have introduced into that nothing. You have introduced differentiation. And once you introduce any sort of differentiation, information starts being created. So if you go back and you read the ancient Egyptian texts, there was a famous Egyptologist, kind of an alternative Egyptologist, by the name of Rene Schwaller-Knubisch.
Yes.
And he was a genius at reading these Egyptian texts in this way because he was also a trained mathematician. And he refers to this first act of differentiation, and he calls it the primary decision. But what he's really talking about is that at that very moment, information is created. And once information is created, if you follow the mathematical language of the way that this unfolds quite carefully, that information is never lost. It just creates more information. So what you have really in some of these Soviet papers that began to be published in the 70s, they really entered the open literature in the late 1980s and early 1990s. What you really have is the idea that this information is really nothing but a set of differentiated nothings. Okay. So you have empty sets, if you're familiar with basic language of set theory, you have empty sets nested inside of empty sets, nested inside of empty sets, and so on and so
Okay.
forth. So you've got all of these bracketings occurring, to borrow the philosophical term of mind. You have all of these bracketings kind of borrowing from the term phenomenology taking place.
Yes.
So it's a breathtaking thing, and then you go back and realize that hey, this is all ancient Egyptian stuff.
Oh yeah, no, that's
the Hermetica.
Yes.
And so on and so forth.
Well, okay, so how does let's bring this full circle up to the point of the U.S. Navy and the Philadelphia experiment. Do you think that people in those circles, in those intelligence circles, are they onto this, and is that what they're thinking, and is that what they're after?
Well, let's tie it in with this information creating medium. The most stable way that nature creates information, or the most stable systems that nature creates, are precisely rotating systems. So if you're going to differentiate a bunch of nothing, what you do is you set it into rotation. Okay, so with the Philadelphia experiment, you've got all of this physics and conceptual ferment taking place between the war, and then Krohn comes along, and he gives it the added twist that, hey, folks, this stuff is all engineering.
Wow, yeah.
So, you've got all this kind of feeling, the thinking on both sides of the Atlantic, and on both sides of the war. So the U.S. Navy, the way I've reconstructed the Philadelphia experiment is that, we've got the invasion of Europe coming up, and the last thing we want is all those big guns that the Germans have on the French coast sinking our ships because they can hone in on their, radar. So they're thinking, well, let's find a way to make our ships less radar visible. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can do it by cloaking them in a very strong electromagnetic field that will literally bend the signal over the ship. In other words, the Germans won't get a return on their radar set, so to speak.
Right.
So they perform this experiment, but what happens, according to the best reconstruction that I can piece together, is that the ship was rendered optically invisible as well. It disappeared.
Yeah.
But, I think from all indications, there were some American scientists, in fact, a German-American scientist who came over with Einstein by the name of Sommerfeld, that kind of warned the Navy, from what I can tell, that, there was a small danger that something like this might happen.
Oh, wow.
So, they turned this thing on, and then they lose the ship. But I think what happened as a result of this, and I'm working up to the other part of your question. I know I tend to go around Harvey's barn a lot.
Don't worry about it, it's fine.
I think what happened was when they got these unexpected results that they got, they realized that they had crossed some threshold that they were not really expecting. And at that point, they pulled the plug on the project, ostensibly, and it stopped. But what I think actually happened was that the project at that point, because they had more or less stumbled onto this effect, it went deeply, deeply black. So in answer to the second part of your question is, yes, I think that there are circles within the U.S. military, particularly within probably the Air Force and the Navy, that are fully aware of some of these physics principles.
Right.
The bad news is the reason I picked the Philadelphia experiment to set right in the middle of a series of books on Nazi secret weapons is to show that the Nazis were rationalizing this physics to a much more detailed and fuller degree. And that they had probably anticipated most of these effects, because their late war radar experiments certainly indicates that they were on to something very, very different than their Allied counterparts. A number of their other projects did as well.
Right. Well, I've heard you in other interviews. I've heard you talk about that, and you point out that that it's likely that we were scared of what they had come upon.
Well, I think so. If you're aiming to achieve simply a radar invisibility, all of a sudden you can't find a ship, and then according to some versions of the story, which versions incidentally I do not happen to accept, but according to some versions of the Philadelphia experiment story, when the field was finally turned off on the Eldridge, the ship that they were supposed to be using for this experiment, when it was finally turned off, you've heard the grisly stories of some sailors being embedded in bulkheads, kind of a grisly organometallic metallic fusion,
right.
Having to have amputated and so on and so forth. But that version of the story actually is something that comes out much, much later. It is not part of the original story. But in any case, I think, regardless of what actually happened, I think that at the point that they achieved optical invisibility, that they realized again that, this has run away from us. It far exceeded what we were expecting to have happen. So we better get a handle on the theory and the real physics behind all of this before we do any more with it. So yes, I think definitely they were scared to a certain extent.
So do you think did any of the teleportation happen? Is that what you think?
That's another part of the Philadelphia experiment legend.
Right.
And again, it's a later development of the story. It's kind of like the Roswell story. It's
right.
That never ends,
Sure.
The latest eyewitness.
It's a growing legend, right?
That's something that is a later of the story. The interesting thing, the way I kind of rationalize the experiment in terms of what I think may have been the physics basis behind it, is that there may theoretically have been some sort of teleportation that was possible. Okay. But that's as far as I'm willing to go. I don't subscribe to the later versions of the theory. I think probably they just took out optical.
So they didn't build a Stargate, and then we didn't send Kurt Russell. We didn't send Kurt Russell to the other side to bring back. Okay. Probably a lot of people are, that's probably people tend to leap on to the most, sensational possible theory. But okay, so tell us about if you don't. I mean, I don't want to keep you too long. I can go as long as you want to, but this is just I'm having a blast. Tell us about Morris Jessup's bizarre actions and the Men in Black, and the weird part that I think lends credence to all this is that all throughout the Navy is interested in this. I mean, skeptics will say, well, this is just so out there. There's not really a reason to pay attention to this. But why is the Navy so interested in this if it's so just kooky? I mean, there's something going on here.
Well, we have only to point to the existence of modern radar stealth aircraft, and for that matter, stealth ships that the Air Force and Navy have been developing to show that they have been interested in this whole area. And incidentally, the whole idea of radar stealth goes back to World War II. The ones that were pursuing it with a vengeance, of course, were the Germans, but certainly the Allies had their own interest in the matter as well. So, from one point of view, the rationale for the Philadelphia experiment makes sense if that's really all that they were after.
Right.
But you mentioned Morris Jessup, and to kind of give your listeners that may not know who this man was, he was a serious credentialed astronomer back in the 50s, early 50s.
Okay.
He had, in fact, run the largest refracting telescope observatory in the southern hemisphere.
Okay.
And had, to his credit, to this day, there are a number of double star systems that he discovered. He kind of made that.
So this is not just some this is not just some goofball off the street. I mean,
no, not at all. Although he wrote some very bizarre books.
right.
Because he became interested in his studies. He was also kind of an amateur archaeologist, and of course he stumbled across many of the monolithic ruins down in Latin America. And thought, there's no way that Incas or Mayans or any of those societies were capable of So, to his scientist's mind, the only way to explain how you got these just gigantic stones to be moved into place was by some form of anti-gravity.
Okay.
And then launched him on the career of examining the whole subject of very high ancient civilizations and so on and so forth. And Jessup got into the Philadelphia experiment story because he published a book. I forget what the title exactly is, but he published a book on the subject of UFOs.
Okay.
Just kind of examining all the strange reports that had been circulated up to the mid-50s about, UFOs and their strange properties. And as a result of publishing this book, he was contacted by the man that the Philadelphia experiment story is really based upon, a fellow by the name of Carlos Allende, who wrote Jessup and told him that, well, you ought to investigate this thing about the Navy experimenting and making the ship invisible during World War II. And Jessup just kind of thought, well, he laughed that off and dismissed the postcard as kind of a prank.
Yeah.
But then the U.S. Navy contacted Jessup because the Navy had been sent a copy of Jessup's UFO book that had been heavily written in the margins. And I know exactly what the Navy was dealing with because I'm a note taker in my books. I have all my notes are in all of my books.
Yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah, so the Navy contacted Jessup and called him down to the Pentagon in D.C. and showed him this marked up copy of his book. And the funny thing about the annotations in his book were that he recognized the poor spelling and grammatical errors
Yes.
in some of the goofy turns of expression
Right.
as being very similar to these letters he was getting from this Carlos Allende.
Right.
And he told the Navy, I've gotten a couple letters apparently from the same guy. So the Navy at this point turned an interest in the whole subject and decides that, well, we're going to publish this book of Jessup's with the annotations.
Right.
And the company that publishes it is the Barrow Company in Dallas, Texas, actually, a little town called Barrow, right outside of Dallas.
Okay.
So they publish Jessup's book with all of these bizarre annotations in the book. And they give Jessup 3 copies of this. And then they circulate the rest of these copies. I think there is 140 some odd copies that they actually printed
Okay.
to top people in the Pentagon. Now here's the curveball, Jay. When they published this book, the committee in the Navy, in the Pentagon that did this, was the Office of Naval Research, okay? And its interest was because in these annotations in Jessup's book, there was mention of anti-gravity and certain very specific sorts of physics principles that
Right.
were just downright, again, bizarre. And I make the case in Secrets of the Unified Field that probably one of the people that got a copy of this annotated version of Jessup's book was none other than Dr. Werner von Braun. So, the plot thickens. But yeah, the Navy and Jessup got into this whole thing, and Jessup himself, as you indicated, kind of had weird things begin to happen to him.
Yes.
He began to show evidence to his friends and family that he was beginning to get a little paranoid.
Right.
He went to dinner with a good friend of his by the name of Ivan Sanderson. Your listeners that are interested in alternative research will recognize that name.
Mhm.
And Sanderson was given a couple of copies of this annotated version of Jessup, and Jessup told him, if you don't hear from me again, make sure that you keep and hang on to those, because they'll be valuable someday. And about 3 weeks later, Jessup supposedly had committed suicide. He was found dead in his car
Right.
with a pipe running from the tailpipe into the cab of his car. Some versions of his death have it that he died on the way to the hospital, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But again, I find this very implausible because Jessup was a fairly decent family man.
Right.
And up to the last couple of weeks of his life, he wasn't really showing any signs of severe depression, and he did make those strange remarks to Ivan Sanderson. So
Sure.
somebody apparently had, in my opinion, had murdered Dr. Jessup
Yes.
because he was getting far too close, in their opinion, to
Yes.
this stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, anytime we hear about these deep government projects, almost always, somebody ends up,
Right.
no longer alive. So
Well, they begin to have strange things happen to them. Yes, mail open, cell phone
yes,
gets bugged, or people calling them, don't answer when you pick up the
Right.
phone. Just all sorts,
well,
all sorts of strange stuff begins to happen.
well, as I was reading those letters, the Allende letters, and again, I don't know. I'm curious. Do you think that the oddities about the letter were they maybe odd on purpose to sort of hide things?
That's really an excellent question. I don't think that they were. Allende, if you read him carefully, was, by his own reckoning and his own account, exposed to some aspect of the field that surrounded
Right.
the ship
Right.
tested. Now, I do reproduce a scientific analysis of the Philadelphia experiment that was done by some PhDs in electrical engineering physicists that kind of reconstructed a simplified version of the experiment just to see how, would this actually work?
Yeah.
Much to their surprise, it did, So they reasoned that anybody exposed to the intensely strong electromagnetic fields that may have been on that ship at the time would have experienced some sort of physiological and psychological effect. After all, the circuitry in our own bodies is basically electrochemical. So, exposure to a field like that over time, and particularly a strong and intense field, is certainly probably going to scramble some of the circuits.
Right.
And I think probably that Jesup, his strange way of expressing things, and that
exactly
to describe it, is probably doing so because some of his circuitry was scrambled.
A little bit out of wire. So he's on a bad acid trip from that point on.
One that he can't get over.
Exactly. Right. Well, okay. So I hate to go. I want to go back a little bit just because I skipped this question and I wanted your take on it. I don't mean to break up the flow, but you talk about the electrical machines that they all seem to have a similar field, and that you can derive from one machine the principles behind any.
Okay, well that basically is Krone's idea.
Right.
It's his whole approach to electrical engineering.
So let me ask this. As a philosopher, the first thing that I thought of is, does this relate to sort of the ancient philosophical problem of the one and the many, and universals in particular?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah. This is again why I say if you look at those ancient metaphysical texts that deal with, let's take the Neoplatonic conception of simplicity.
Right.
Well, as you well know, studying philosophy, if you study those types of texts philosophically, you're taught to approach and interpret what they say from a principally metaphysical point of view.
Right.
But if you take off those spectacles and put on topological spectacles or physicist spectacles, you're going to see a very different thing. And what the Neoplatonists are actually talking about is a physical medium with certain specific properties. So, Crone, when he looks at electrical machines, as he looks at the whole problem of electrical machines, what he believes is that you have a generalized electrical machine involving things like current, voltage, impedance, and resistance, and so on and so forth. Okay, those are your basic concepts. And if you take the tensor calculus, let me explain what tensor calculus does. Maybe this will help illustrate what I'm talking about just a little bit better.
Sure.
Tensor calculus is simply a mathematical technique that is able to transform an object in a certain set of coordinates into the same object in another set of coordinates, or it can take that object and transform it into another object.
Okay.
There are certain specific procedures that tensor calculus uses to do this. So what Crone does is when he takes the tensor calculus and applies it to electrical engineering, what he's actually doing is he's taking that generalized electrical machine that every electrical engineer learns the basic components of, again, resistance, amperage, watts, volts, and so on.
Sure.
And he takes the tensor calculus and shows how you can take any electrical machine and by the application of tensors transform it into any other electrical machine. Okay? So this is the whole secret, really, to Gabriel Crone. And again, if you are a bunch of Nazis in Germany reading this paper and you have theoretical brain lenses like Walter Gerlach or Theodor Kaluza and everybody that was in Nazi Germany one time, looking at this and saying, aha,
yes,
we've got the key. We've got to turn it in block and open up all sorts of new possibilities.
So, how does what did the Allies miss? In other words, do you think that the Nazis saw something that the Allies missed?
An excellent question, and basically, and I go back to my answer. We are taught as part of our standard history
Right.
that the reason for the massive failure of physics in Nazi Germany is simply because they deliberately discarded relativity.
Okay.
But again, if you dig into the actual history of what the Nazis did and what they actually accomplished, what you will quickly discover is that they simply refused to box themselves into one of the biggest dead ends in physics.
Okay.
Because let's look at what relativity does. In general relativity, the only way that you can truly affect the fabric of space-time is in the presence of an extremely large mass, like a planet or a star.
Okay.
Only in that instance is it possible to exert a very small electromagnetic influence. In other words, the famous example of Arthur Eddington proving, quote-unquote, general